The clock on David Thompson's computer screen showed 11:15 p.m. He rubbed his tired eyes and leaned back in his leather chair, looking around his office in City Hall. Papers were scattered across his desk, budget reports mixed with community proposals and letters from residents. Being mayor of Riverside wasn't easy, but David loved serving his community. Tonight had been particularly tough. The city council meeting ran 3 hours longer than expected. Everyone wanted to talk about the new community center, the road repairs on 5th Street, and the ongoing debate about parking meters downtown. David listened to every concern, took notes on every complaint, and tried his best to find solutions that would work for everyone. His stomach growled loudly in the quiet office. He'd grabbed a quick sandwich around 6, but that felt like ages ago. His wife Carol had texted him twice asking when he'd be home. Their daughter Ashley had a soccer game tomorrow morning, and she wanted him to help her practice penalty kicks before bed. But by now, both his girls were probably fast asleep. David stood up slowly, feeling the stiffness in his back from sitting too long. At 45, these late nights were getting harder. He gathered the important papers into neat piles, locked the sensitive documents in his filing cabinet, and grabbed his jacket from the coat rack by the door. The building was completely empty now. Even Mrs. Peterson, the night security guard, had gone home an hour ago. He walked through the marble hallways of City Hall, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The building had history. Built in 1892, it had weathered 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and countless political changes. David often wondered about all the mayors who had walked these same halls, facing their own challenges and making decisions that shaped the community. Outside, the October air hit him like a cold slap. Winter was coming early this year. David pulled his gray hoodie over his head and zipped up his jacket. He'd learned long ago that being mayor didn't mean he had to wear a suit everywhere. Tonight, comfort mattered more than appearance. The hoodie was a gift from Ashley last Christmas with "World's Best Dad" printed on the front in faded letters. The downtown streets were mostly empty. A few restaurants were still serving late dinners, their warm yellow lights spilling onto the sidewalks. David could smell pizza from Tony's Italian kitchen and hear quiet laughter from the corner cafe. These were the moments he treasured, seeing his city alive and thriving, even in the quiet hours. As he walked, David thought about the challenges ahead. The city budget was tight, and they needed to make some difficult decisions. The police department wanted new equipment. The fire department needed a new truck, and the schools were asking for more funding. Meanwhile, residents complained about rising taxes and wanted better services. Finding balance seemed impossible sometimes. 3 months ago, there had been a series of break-ins downtown. Small businesses were worried. Residents felt unsafe walking at night, and the police were working overtime to catch the criminals. David had promised the community that safety was his top priority. Extra patrols were added, security cameras were installed, and community watch programs were strengthened. The crime wave had affected everyone differently. Some people stopped coming downtown after dark. Others demanded more aggressive policing. David tried to find a middle ground, supporting law enforcement while also protecting civil liberties. It was a delicate balance that kept him awake many nights. Walking past Johnson's electronics store, David noticed the boarded-up window. Last Tuesday night, someone had thrown a brick through the glass and stolen several phones and tablets. Mr. Johnson, who'd owned the store for 20 years, was considering closing permanently. The thought made David's heart heavy. Small businesses were the backbone of Riverside's economy. David's car was parked 2 blocks away in the municipal lot. He usually parked closer, but tonight he'd arrived late for a meeting and had to take whatever spot he could find. The walk didn't bother him. He actually enjoyed these quiet moments to think and reflect on the day's events. The streetlights cast long shadows as he walked. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air. David pulled his hands deeper into his jacket pockets and quickened his pace slightly. Tomorrow would be another busy day, starting with breakfast with the Chamber of Commerce and ending with a town hall meeting about the proposed bike path project. As mayor, David had learned that leadership meant being available to everyone. Rich or poor, young or old, every resident deserved to have their voice heard. He'd grown up in Riverside, attended the local schools, and married his high school sweetheart. This wasn't just his job. It was his home, his community, his responsibility. His phone buzzed with a text message from Carol. "Hope you're heading home soon. Ashley practiced her kicks until 10 p.m. She's excited to show you tomorrow." David smiled and typed back, "On my way now. Tell her I'm proud of her dedication." The municipal parking lot was nearly empty. David's blue Honda Civic sat alone under a flickering street light. He'd bought the car 3 years ago when he became mayor, choosing something practical and affordable. Some politicians drove fancy cars, but David believed in leading by example. Public servants should live modestly and spend taxpayer money wisely. As he approached his car, David felt grateful for the quiet moment. Being mayor meant constant meetings, phone calls, and public appearances. Everyone wanted a piece of his time, and privacy was rare. These few minutes of solitude walking through his city in the peaceful night reminded him why he'd chosen this path. He thought about his father, who had worked at the steel mill for 35 years. His dad taught him that honest work and community service mattered more than wealth or fame. "Leave things better than you found them," his father always said. David tried to live by those words every day. Reaching into his pocket for his car keys, David looked forward to the drive home. Carol would probably be waiting up with a cup of tea and questions about the meeting. They'd talk quietly in the kitchen while he unwound from the day. Then he'd check on Ashley, kiss her forehead, and finally get some rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight had been productive. The community center project was moving forward. The road repairs were approved, and they'd found a compromise on the parking meter issue. Small victories, but important ones for the people of Riverside. David had no idea that his simple walk to the car was about to change everything. Detective Mike Rodriguez had been patrolling Riverside's downtown area for 8 years. Tonight he was riding with his new partner, Detective Amy Foster, who had just transferred from the neighboring county. Amy was eager to prove herself, and had spent the evening asking questions about local crime patterns and community issues. "Tell me more about these break-ins," Amy said as they cruised slowly down Main Street. "The reports mention a pattern, but I want to understand what we're dealing with." Mike adjusted his rearview mirror and pointed toward the row of small businesses. 3 hits in the past month. Always the same style. Quick smash and grab, mostly electronics and cash. The security cameras haven't caught much, just a figure in dark clothing moving fast. Amy pulled out her notepad and reviewed the case details. The witness descriptions are pretty vague. Black male, average height, dark hoodie or jacket. That could describe half the men in this city. "That's the problem," Mike replied, slowing down as they passed Johnson's electronics store. "We've got almost nothing to work with. The guy knows how to avoid the cameras, and he's in and out in less than 3 minutes every time." The radio crackled with routine check-ins from other patrol units. Saturday nights were usually busy with bar fights, domestic disturbances, and traffic violations. But tonight seemed unusually quiet. Amy was grateful for the peaceful evening. It gave her time to learn the area and get comfortable with her new partner. Mike had a reputation for being thorough and fair. Other officers respected his judgment, and the community trusted him. He'd grown up in Riverside, knew most of the business owners personally, and believed strongly in community policing. His approach was simple: treat everyone with respect, but stay alert for suspicious behavior. "The business owners are really worried," Mike continued as they turned onto Oak Street. "Mr. Johnson at the electronics store is thinking about closing. He's been robbed twice in 2 months. The man's scared to work late anymore." Amy nodded sympathetically. "I can understand that. Small business owners don't have the security resources that big corporations do. A few break-ins can destroy them financially." They drove in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both officers scanning the sidewalks and alleyways. Amy was impressed by how well Mike knew the area. He could tell her the history of every building, the names of regular pedestrians, and which areas tended to have more problems. At 11:20 p.m., they were approaching the City Hall area when Amy spotted a lone figure walking down the sidewalk. The person was wearing a dark hoodie and moving at a steady pace, hands in pockets, hood up against the cold night air. "Mike, look at that," Amy said quietly, pointing toward the figure. "Dark hoodie, walking alone near the area where we've had problems. Could be our guy." Mike looked where she was pointing. The person was about 2 blocks from Johnson's electronics store, walking in the direction of the municipal parking lot. The timing was suspicious, most honest, Sierra. Tysons weren't wandering around downtown alone at this hour, especially in that area. "Let's take a closer look," Mike decided. slowing the patrol car. Could be nothing, but we've got to check everything out. The captain's been clear about increasing our presence in this area. Amy felt her heart rate increase slightly. This was her first potential stop in Riverside, and she wanted to handle it professionally. She'd worked plenty of cases in her previous job, but every community was different. She needed to prove to Mike and the department that she belonged here. As they followed slowly behind the walking figure, Amy noticed several things that caught her attention. The person seemed to know where they were going, walking confidently rather than looking around nervously. Their pace was steady, not rushed like someone trying to escape or hide. He's not acting particularly suspicious, Amy observed, but the location and timing still concern me. Mike nodded. The break-ins have all happened between 10 p.m. and midnight. And this is right in the target area. We should at least talk to him, see what he's doing out here. They watched as the figure turned toward the municipal parking lot. This struck both officers as odd. The lot was mostly empty at this hour, and it wasn't a place where people usually walked unless they had business there. That settles it, Mike said, accelerating slightly to catch up. Let's make contact. Amy checked her radio and made sure her body camera was recording. Department policy required documentation of all citizen contacts, especially in areas where there had been recent criminal activity. She also noted their exact location and time for the incident report. This is Unit 47, Mike radioed to dispatch. We're making a pedestrian contact at Main and 3rd Street, near the municipal lot. One individual, routine check. Copy that, Unit 47, came the response. Time logged at 11:22 p.m. Mike pulled the patrol car alongside the sidewalk about 20 feet ahead of the walking figure. Both officers stepped out of the vehicle, maintaining professional postures but staying alert. The department had trained them to approach every situation calmly but prepared for anything. "Excuse me, sir," Mike called out in a friendly but authoritative tone. "Could we speak with you for a moment?" The figure stopped walking and turned toward them. Amy could see it was a black man, probably in his 40s, wearing a gray hoodie and dark jacket. His hands were visible and his body language seemed relaxed rather than defensive. "Good evening, officers," the man replied politely. "Is there a problem?" Amy noticed that his voice was educated and calm. He wasn't acting nervous or trying to avoid them. Still, she'd learned in training that criminals could be very good at appearing innocent. The break-in suspect had managed to avoid capture for months, which suggested intelligence and self-control. "We've been having some issues with break-ins in this area," Mike explained, walking closer while keeping his distance respectful. "We're just checking with anyone we see in the area during these late hours. Can you tell us what brings you out tonight?" The man seemed to consider the question carefully before answering. "I was working late and I'm heading to my car," he said, gesturing toward the municipal parking lot. "Is there a specific concern about me being here?" Amy stepped forward slightly. "We just need to verify who you are and what you're doing in the area. There have been 3 break-ins nearby in the past month, all involving someone matching your general description." She watched the man's face carefully for any reaction. Most innocent people showed surprise or concern when told they matched a criminal description. This man simply nodded with understanding, which struck her as unusual. "I understand you're doing your job," the man said calmly. "What do you need from me?" Mike and Amy exchanged a quick glance. The man's cooperation was good, but something felt different about this interaction. Most people in this situation showed more emotion, either fear, anger, or nervousness. This person seemed almost professionally calm. "We'll need to see some identification," Amy said, "and we'd like to ask you a few questions about your activities tonight." The man reached slowly into his back pocket, making sure both officers could see his movements. "I'm getting my wallet," he said clearly. "My ID is inside." As he pulled out a leather wallet, Amy noticed it looked expensive and well-maintained. Not the kind of thing she'd expect from someone committing petty break-ins. Still, she'd learned not to judge criminals by their appearance or possessions. "Thank you for your cooperation," Mike said as the man handed over his driver's license. "This will just take a few minutes." In the dim streetlight, Amy could barely make out the name on the license. Mike held it closer to their flashlight, squinting to read the small text. Neither officer paid close attention to the details. They were more focused on the man's behavior and responses. What they didn't realize was that they were about to make a discovery that would change everything. They thought they knew about this routine late-night stop. The name on that driver's license was about to turn their simple investigation into something much more complicated and embarrassing than either detective could have imagined. Detective Mike Rodriguez took the driver's license and glanced at it, briefly before focusing back on the man in the hoodie. The late hour and poor street lighting made reading difficult, and both officers were more interested in observing the suspect's behavior than examining identification details closely. Okay. Mr. Mike paused, holding the license under his flashlight. The name looked familiar somehow, but he couldn't quite place it. Can you tell us where you're coming from tonight? David Thompson stood calmly on the sidewalk, his hands visible and his posture relaxed. He'd been in situations like this before, not as a suspect, but as mayor attending community meetings where police procedures were discussed. He understood that the officers were doing their job, even if the circumstances felt uncomfortable. I was working late at City Hall, David answered honestly. I'm walking to my car in the municipal lot. Amy Foster stepped closer, her notepad ready. City Hall? What kind of work do you do there? The building's been closed for hours. David considered his response carefully. He could simply say he was the mayor and end this quickly, but something made him hesitate. Maybe it was curiosity about how this would unfold, or perhaps he wanted to understand firsthand what citizens experienced during police stops. I work in local government, he said, which was technically true. Sometimes we have to work late to finish important projects. Mike looked skeptical. Local government? What department? And do you have any way to prove you were actually in City Hall tonight? The questions came faster now, and David could sense the officer's suspicion growing. He realized that his casual answers weren't satisfying them. In their minds, a legitimate city employee would probably be more specific and have official identification or security cards. I work directly with city leadership, David explained. I don't carry my work ID when I'm leaving for the day, but I can show you my key card if that would help. Amy made notes while Mike continued the questioning. So you're telling us you work for the city, but you don't have any identification proving that? And you're walking around alone at midnight in an area where we've had multiple break-ins? David felt a familiar frustration rising. This was exactly the kind of interaction that concerned him about police-community relations. The officers had decided he was suspicious based on his appearance and location, and now they were building a case around that assumption instead of gathering facts objectively. Officers, I understand your concern about the recent crimes, David said, maintaining his calm tone.
But I haven't done anything wrong.
I'm simply walking to my car after finishing work. Mike handed the driver's license to Amy without really studying it. The break-ins have all involved someone who looks similar to you, wearing similar clothing in this exact area. You can understand why we need to be thorough. Amy glanced at the license briefly, noting the address and basic information, but the poor lighting and her focus on the interrogation meant she didn't process the name carefully. Mr. Thompson, is it? Can you be more specific about what kind of work you do for the city? David felt caught between honesty and the desire to see how this situation would develop naturally. I'm involved in budget planning, community development, and policy decisions. I work closely with the city council and department heads. That's pretty vague, Mike observed. Are you some kind of consultant? An accountant? What's your specific job title? The questioning was becoming more intense, and David could see that his reluctance to be completely direct was making things worse. But he was also learning valuable lessons about how citizens felt when they were stopped and questioned by police. I'm an elected official, David finally said, hoping this would clarify things without having to explicitly state his position. Amy looked up from her notepad. Elected official? Like city council? Which district do you represent? Mike crossed his arms and studied David more carefully. If you're really on the city council, why don't you just say so? And why are you being so evasive about simple questions? David realized that his attempt to experience this situation from a citizen's perspective was backfiring. The officers were becoming more suspicious because of his indirect answers, not less. He was actually making the situation worse for himself. I'm not trying to be evasive, David explained. I'm just trying to answer your questions accurately. I am an elected official and I was working late on city business. Amy stepped back and spoke quietly to her partner. Mike, something doesn't feel right about this. His story keeps changing slightly, and he's being very careful about how he answers. Plus, what elected official wears a hoodie and walks around alone at midnight? Mike nodded. He'd noticed the same things. In his experience, people who were telling the truth were usually more straightforward and specific. This man seemed intelligent and articulate, but also evasive in a way that suggested he was hiding something. "Mr. Thompson," Mike said more formally, "we need you to be completely honest with us. What exactly is your position with the city, and do you have any proof of your identity besides this driver's license?" David felt the situation escalating beyond what he'd intended. He could see doubt and suspicion in both officers' faces. His experiment in experiencing citizen police interactions was teaching him more than he'd bargained for. "Officers, I understand this looks suspicious," David said, choosing his words carefully. "But I really am who I say I am, and I really was working late at City Hall. I can prove it if necessary." Amy consulted her notes. "You said you don't carry work identification, but now you're saying you can prove it? Which is it?" The contradiction hadn't been intentional, but David could see how it looked. He was learning that even honest citizens could appear suspicious if they weren't careful about consistency in their answers. Mike decided to try a different approach. "Look, Mr. Thompson, we're not trying to give you a hard time, but we've got 3 unsolved break-ins and you match the suspect description perfectly. You're in the right place at the right time, and your explanations aren't adding up clearly." David looked at both officers and realized this had gone far enough. His attempt to understand the citizen experience was creating unnecessary tension and taking up valuable police time. But he'd also learned something important about how easily interactions could escalate based on assumptions and poor communication. "Officers," David said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Let me be completely clear about who I am." Amy held up her hand. "Before you say anything else, we need to check your background and verify your story. Can you please put your hands on the patrol car while we confirm your identity?" David felt a moment of genuine concern. The situation had escalated to the point where the officers were treating him as a potential criminal suspect. He realized that many citizens experienced exactly this kind of fear and uncertainty during police encounters. Mike noticed David's hesitation. "Sir, this is just a precaution while we verify your information. If everything checks out, you'll be free to go." As David placed his hands on the cold metal of the patrol car, he understood more clearly than ever why police-community relations needed improvement. Even when everyone was trying to do the right thing, miscommunication and assumptions could turn a simple encounter into something much more serious. What the officers didn't realize was that the truth about David's identity was literally in their hands, printed clearly on the driver's license they'd barely examined. In just a few moments, their routine investigation would become one of the most embarrassing and educational experiences of their careers. Amy Foster held David Thompson's driver's license under the patrol car's bright interior light, preparing to call in the information for a background check. As she positioned the plastic card to read the details clearly, something made her pause. The address looked familiar. It was in the upscale neighborhood where she knew several prominent citizens lived. "Mike," she said quietly, "take a look at this address. Isn't this where—" Mike leaned over to see the license better. As his eyes focused on the name printed in bold letters, his face went completely pale. "Oh no," he whispered. "Amy, look at the name. Really look at it." Amy focused on the license again, this time reading every detail carefully. David Richard Thompson, age 45, with an address she now recognized as the mayor's residence that had been featured in the local newspaper. Her stomach dropped as the realization hit her. "Is this—" she started, then stopped, hoping she was wrong. Mike ran his hand over his face, a gesture David recognized even from his position facing the patrol car. "Mr. Thompson," Mike said, his voice now completely different. "Are you Mayor David Thompson?" David turned around slowly, seeing the recognition and growing embarrassment on both officers' faces. "Yes, I am," he said simply. "I tried to tell you I was an elected official." Amy felt her face burning with embarrassment. She'd been a police officer for 6 years and had never made such a significant mistake. "Mr. Mayor, I'm so sorry. We didn't realize." Mike was equally mortified. He'd lived in Riverside his entire life, had voted for Mayor Thompson, and had even attended several community meetings where the mayor spoke about police-community relations. Now he'd spent 20 minutes treating him like a criminal suspect. "Sir, please accept our apologies," Mike said formally. "This was a complete misunderstanding. We should have looked at your identification more carefully from the beginning." David stepped away from the patrol car and faced both officers. He could see their genuine distress and embarrassment, but he also saw an opportunity for something more important than anger or blame. "Officers, please don't apologize," David said calmly. "You were doing your job. You saw someone who matched a suspect description in an area where crimes had occurred. That's exactly what good police work looks like." Amy shook her head. "But we should have been more careful. We should have paid better attention to your identification. And when you said you were an elected official, I wasn't as clear as I could have been," David admitted. "I was curious about experiencing this from a citizen's perspective. Maybe I learned more than I expected to." Mike was struggling with the situation. "Mr. Mayor, you have every right to file a complaint about this. We clearly made assumptions based on—" David held up his hand. "Based on what? A suspect description and suspicious circumstances? Officers, you did everything by the book. You were professional. You asked appropriate questions, and you tried to verify information. The problem wasn't your procedures." Amy looked confused. "Then what was the problem?" David thought carefully before answering. This moment could either create division and blame, or it could become something constructive for everyone involved. "The problem was communication and assumptions on both sides," David explained. "I wasn't as direct as I should have been because I wanted to see how this played out. You made reasonable assumptions based on limited information. But most importantly, we all learned something valuable tonight." Mike was still processing the situation. "What did we learn?" "We learned how easily good intentions can lead to misunderstandings," David said. "We learned how important it is to look at each person as an individual, rather than a description. And we learned that even when everyone is trying to do the right thing, communication matters enormously." Amy realized that Mayor Thompson was not angry, but she was still deeply embarrassed. "Sir, this reflects poorly on our department. We're supposed to know the community we serve." David smiled slightly. "Officers, do you think I walk around wearing a suit and mayoral chain at midnight? I'm just a regular citizen when I'm walking to my car." "The fact that you didn't recognize me isn't the issue." "The issue is what we do with this experience." Mike found himself genuinely curious about the mayor's perspective. "What do you think we should do?" "First, understand that this kind of interaction happens to regular citizens every day," David said. "They don't have the benefit of being able to say, 'I'm the mayor,' to change how they're treated. Second, recognize that good police work requires balancing public safety with community trust." Amy was taking mental notes. "Are you saying we were wrong to stop you?" "Not at all," David replied firmly. "You had reasonable suspicion based on the crime pattern and circumstances. But I want you to think about how this felt from my perspective, and how it might feel for other citizens who don't have my advantages." The conversation was interrupted by the radio crackling with another call. A domestic disturbance 3 blocks away required immediate response. Mike looked torn between answering the call and continuing this important discussion. "Go handle your call," David said, understanding the situation. "But I'd like to continue this conversation soon. This could be valuable for our entire department." Amy was already moving toward the driver's seat. "Mr. Mayor, would you be willing to meet with us and perhaps share this experience with other officers?" David nodded. "Absolutely. But remember, this isn't about blame or mistakes. It's about learning and improving." As the patrol car prepared to leave, Mike rolled down his window. "Sir, are you sure you don't want to file any kind of report about this? The only report I want to see is one that helps us use this experience to build better police-community relations," David replied. "This could be the beginning of something positive," Amy called out from the driver's seat. "Thank you for understanding, Mr. Mayor, and for not being angry with us." David watched the patrol car disappear into the night, its red and blue lights flashing as it responded to the domestic call. He stood alone in the parking lot processing what had just happened. The experience had been more educational than he'd expected. He'd felt the uncertainty and mild fear that came with being questioned as a suspect. He'd experienced how easily miscommunication could escalate a situation. Most importantly, he'd seen firsthand how good officers with good intentions could still create uncomfortable situations for citizens. Walking to his Honda Civic, David realized this incident could become either a source of division or an opportunity for growth. The choice was his to make, and he already knew which direction he wanted to go. Tomorrow he would call Police Chief Williams and arrange a meeting. This experience was too valuable to waste. and the lessons learned tonight could benefit every officer and every citizen in Riverside. As he drove home to Carol and Ashley, Mayor David Thompson was already planning how to turn an embarrassing misunderstanding into meaningful progress for his community. The next morning, David Thompson sat in his kitchen, sipping coffee and thinking about the previous night's encounter. Carol had listened to the entire story with growing amazement, asking questions and expressing concern about how he'd been treated. Ashley, overhearing from the hallway, had been proud that her dad handled everything so calmly. "You're not upset about it?" Carol asked again, refilling his coffee mug. "They treated you like a criminal, David." "They treated me like someone who matched a suspect description," David corrected gently. "There's a difference, and that difference is what we need to work with." By 8 o'clock that morning, David was on the phone with Police Chief Patricia Williams. She was mortified when she heard about the incident and immediately offered to discipline the officers involved. "Pat, absolutely not," David said firmly. "Those officers did their job professionally. If we punish them for following procedures, what message does that send to the rest of the department?" Chief Williams was confused. "But they detained the mayor based on reasonable suspicion and a suspect description," David interrupted. "Pat, this is an opportunity, not a crisis. Can you arrange a meeting with Officers Rodriguez and Foster this afternoon?" 3 hours later, David sat in the police station conference room across from Mike Rodriguez and Amy Foster. Both officers looked uncomfortable, still expecting consequences for their mistake. Chief Williams sat at the head of the table, unsure how this unusual meeting would unfold. "I want to start by thanking both of you," David began, surprising everyone. "Last night you gave me an education I couldn't have gotten any other way." Mike shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mr. Mayor, we should have recognized you. We should have been more careful with your identification. Should you recognize every citizen in Riverside?" David asked. "Should my treatment be different because of my job title?" Amy realized where this was leading. "You're saying we should treat everyone with the same respect and professionalism?" "Exactly," David smiled. "And you did treat me professionally. You were courteous, you followed procedures, and you kept me safe while investigating. The problem wasn't your conduct, it was our communication and assumptions." Over the next hour, they discussed every aspect of the encounter. David described feeling uncertain and slightly intimidated, even though he knew the officers were just doing their job. Mike and Amy talked about how their assumptions about David's evasive answers had increased their suspicion. "The real issue," David explained, "is that this same interaction happens to citizens every day. Most of them don't have the luxury of saying, 'I'm the mayor,' to change the dynamic." Chief Williams was taking detailed notes. "What are you proposing, David?" "I want to use this experience to improve our community policing efforts," David said. "Not to criticize anyone, but to help everyone understand different perspectives." Within 2 weeks, David's encounter had become the foundation for a new training program. Mike Rodriguez and Amy Foster volunteered to share their experience with every officer in the department, describing how assumptions had affected their judgment and communication. The training sessions were unlike anything the police department had done before. Officers role-played different scenarios, with some playing citizens and others playing police. They discussed how factors like race, clothing, and location could unconsciously influence their perceptions. "I realized I saw a black man in a hoodie and made assumptions," Mike admitted to his fellow officers during one training session. "I didn't see a neighbor, a taxpayer, or a public servant. I saw a stereotype." Amy added, "We had reasonable suspicion, but we let that suspicion color how we interpreted everything he said. When he was trying to be helpful, we thought he was being evasive." The story didn't stay within the police department. David decided to share the experience publicly at a community meeting, emphasizing the positive aspects and lessons learned. This wasn't about bad policing, he told a packed auditorium. This was about human nature and the importance of communication. Officers Rodriguez and Foster handled themselves professionally throughout the encounter. The community response was overwhelmingly positive. Citizens appreciated David's honesty and his refusal to blame the officers. The police department gained respect for their willingness to learn and improve, rather than becoming defensive. Local media picked up the story, and soon David was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences across the state. He always brought Mike and Amy with him, making sure their perspective was heard alongside his own. The power of this story, David would tell audiences, isn't that police officers made a mistake. It's that everyone involved chose to learn from the experience rather than let it create division. 6 months later, Riverside's police department had become a model for community relations. Crime rates dropped as community trust increased. Citizens were more willing to report suspicious activity and cooperate with investigations when they felt respected and heard. The electronics store break-ins that had started, the whole chain of events were eventually solved. The real perpetrator was caught during a fourth attempted burglary, a teenager from a neighboring town who had no connection to Riverside's community at all. Mike Rodriguez was promoted to sergeant and put in charge of community policing initiatives. Amy Foster became the department's liaison for bias training programs. Both officers credited their encounter with Mayor Thompson as a turning point in their careers. Chief Williams implemented monthly community meetings where citizens could interact informally with officers, building relationships before problems occurred. The program became so successful that other cities began copying Riverside's approach. David's hoodie, the one Ashley had given him for Christmas, became something of a symbol. He wore it regularly to community events, reminding everyone that mayors, like all citizens, were just regular people who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The most meaningful change came in how officers approached every citizen encounter. They began each interaction by remembering that they were talking to someone's parent, child, neighbor, or friend, not just a potential suspect or problem to solve. 2 years later, David was re-elected mayor by the largest margin in the city's history. During his victory speech, he thanked officers Rodriguez and Foster by name, calling them examples of how good people could turn uncomfortable situations into positive change. That night taught me that our community's strength isn't in avoiding difficult conversations, David told the celebrating crowd. It's in having those conversations with respect, honesty, and a willingness to learn from each other. The encounter that began with assumptions and misunderstanding had become a foundation for trust, communication, and mutual respect. It proved that even embarrassing mistakes could become powerful tools for building stronger communities. Mike and Amy, now veteran officers with years of successful community policing experience, still told new recruits about the night they stopped their own mayor, but they always ended the story the same way. The lesson isn't that we made a mistake. The lesson is that good people can disagree, misunderstand each other, and still come together to create something better. That's what real community policing looks like. David Thompson's late-night walk to his car had lasted 20 minutes. The positive changes it inspired had lasted for years, making Riverside a better place for everyone who called it home.